Welcome to Jesus and Me with Pastor Tom Harmon, who is the lead pastor of Kingsville Community Church. Here you will find relevant Bible teachings and practical training about being a follower of Jesus Christ.
Let's give a warm welcome to Darren McCrea as he comes.
All right. Aren't you glad that Pastor Tom uses notes? I mean, I remember one time, it was about 10, maybe 15 years ago, he didn't use notes, and he introduced me as Darren McCrea, missionary to China. I'm going to come down here. I don't need the extra boost from the podium. I'm going to show you some slides this morning as well. Wow. Been a year. Been a year since we moved back to Columbia. I'm looking at all these beautiful faces, and you know, you haven't changed much. Of course, that's not saying a lot for some of you either. I haven't changed either. My mom, years ago, told me to be, I should never be sarcastic in church, and if she's watching online, I'm sorry, Mom. For those of you who don't know us, and I do see some visitors here this morning, or at least people that have come into the church since we left, my name is Darren McCrea, my wife Patty, and my son my son James are at the back now. I'm calling James Darren and Darren James. And our other son's down in Sunday school. We've been missionaries in Columbia for most of the last 20 years. Matter of fact, on May 2nd, we had our 20th anniversary since the first time I went down to Columbia on what then I thought was going to be a short-term missions trip. And our connection to Kingsville kind of goes back a long time ago, in the sense that Pastor Tom was the pastor that originally sent me out from London, Ontario, where we were attending the same church. Where he was pastoring, I was running sound, driving taxi, and driving him nuts all in the same time. No. He still likes to remember when I did things like lock kids in the trunk of my taxi, just different things. Anyway, I was going to say it, but no, I won't. I just won't. But in 2010, we had come back to Canada to work from here for a 4-year term. We kind of just moved our office. We're living in Leamington, attending here at Kingsville Community Church. Became part of the ministries in the church. Patty was teaching Sunday school. We had a connect group in our home. Pastor Tom asked me to take men's fellowship, a fact for which I still am a little bit mad at him for. But even that part of our story you're going to see this morning was something that God has used in our ministry in Columbia in some pretty spectacular ways. Now, I always say, for those that did I turn this on? No, I didn't. There we go. Oh, yeah, shoot you. We're located in Bogota, Colombia. Bogota is 8,500 feet up in the Andes Mountains. It's a city of 11 million people, and about the size of metropolitan Toronto. And we work throughout the country, as well as doing outreaches in places like the Dominican Republic, where we teach. Cuba, we're going to be going again in October. And Patty and I train missionaries that are literally going all around the world now, in many places in the 1040 window, in like the most closed, dangerous places in the world. And I teach on leadership issues, communications. Patty teaches on how to work with kids with learning disabilities, or that are not where they're supposed to be academically. I say frequently, and most of you have heard this joke, but that she has a specialty in child psychology, which really helps her with her husband. Yeah, we'll deal with you later. And within Columbia, we mobilize the national church. The idea is to raise up hundreds of volunteers to do things that the small community pastor could not normally do, kind of like we're raising up all kinds of volunteers to do Celebrate Canada tonight. And the idea is just to serve with food, to serve with clothing, medical and dental needs in the community. Not only just fixing teeth, but also teaching them about dental hygiene. And sometimes we're just a bunch of clowns. Matter of fact, most of the time we're a bunch of clowns. But in these outreaches where we will literally present the gospel to 5,000 to 6,000 people in a weekend, we are reaching kids, we're reaching youth, and in the process, talking to their parents, because we will have professionals like doctors and lawyers that have never been able to use their profession in God's service. They've only been utilized for their financial resources. Now that for the first time, they're realizing, wow, God can really use me as a person with the gifts and abilities that he's given me, and they can take back that into the community. But the highlight for us of all the work we do is international teams. Teams like this. This is a group from Detroit that's going to be coming back down in July. Matter of fact, we return to Columbia July 23rd, July 24th at 5 a.m. This group comes in. And they've enabled us to reach into schools where literally in a couple weeks at times, we've been able to present the gospel to 11,000 students. Now, a scene like this is something that is now normal for us. Where this is my favorite picture of outreaches, that's why some of you have seen it. But literally dozens of schools across Columbia, we've been able to go in and share the hope there is in Jesus, because we go in with our stories. We tell people about all the things that we've gone through in the past, whether it's rape, abuse, incest, homosexuality, so many different things that God has brought us out of. And many times we forget in the church that the power that we have as Christians is the power in our story. Because people can argue God until the end of the day, but they can't argue with what you've experienced. And in my case, for those who don't know me, I was the street kid in East London that God has taken to the nations. And the power of everything that has happened since then is all about him and nothing about me. Now, I love doing missions as much as I love being a Christian, because I love living on the edge of a miracle every day. Sometimes we forget the potential, the spark, who lives in us, and the fact that we literally have the potential of a miracle happening in our lives every day that we're on this planet. Because while you may not think that you're a whole lot, God in you is far more than you could ever think or experience. Now, sometimes days or months pass in our lives, but I'm always expecting to God to do something, and soon. And this morning I want to talk about another kind of outreach team that we do. This is a group from West Edmonton Christian Assembly. They came down to work with us in August. And it was a group of just normal guys. In this case, it was the first father-son outreach of their men's ministry at West Edmonton Christian Assembly. Now, I thought it really bizarre. I mean, when I went back to Columbia, I was asking God, you just had me doing men's ministry in a small church in Canada for 3 years. Why? He says, because I want you to open up opportunities for men's ministry in Columbia. And so last year, even before we moved back to Columbia, we had a team in from Pickering Pentecostal, and we were doing men's ministry in one of the local churches and saw the need for it. Many of you have heard this statistic, but for those of you who haven't, if you reach a child, you have a 3% chance of reaching his family. If you reach the mother, you have a 22% chance of reaching her family. But if you reach the man in the home, you have a 92% chance of reaching his family. So men's ministry is important. Men's ministry is something that can open up a lot of doors. And in this case, it was a chance for us to minister into the team as much as it was for the team to minister into the communities that we were working with. But before we talk more about them, I want to go to Luke 9. Luke chapter 9, verses 1 through 8. You see, when the disciples had been with Jesus for about a year, he decided that now it was the time to show the disciples that he was not the only one that could do ministry. It was time to give them some work experience. It was time for them to learn through their mistakes. And let me pause there for a second to say, in the church, a lot of times, we don't allow people to make mistakes. It's often been said the army of the high God is the only one in the world that shoots its wounded. We need to be able to give grace and mercy to people even as they're attempting to do new things, even when they make mistakes, because that's how they're going to learn from them. You would never treat your child the way you treat some of your brothers and sisters when they make a mistake. Your child makes a mistake, and you love and you have mercy and you teach them to do better, and that's the way we should teach each other in the body of Christ. And Jesus looked at this group of 12 disciples and said, okay, it's time for them to do something. It was time for them to get out of their comfort zone, to get out of the normal. Or like I used to like to say, it was time to send out the first ever short-term missions team. Verse 1, it says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If the people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave their town as a testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. Now Herod, the Tetrarch, heard about all that was going on, and he was perplexed. The outreach team from Kingsville Community Church went down to Minnesota, and God started doing things, and President Obama heard about it, and he was perplexed. Because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead, others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. Now, you can bet that when the disciples went out, they did not feel qualified. Not even a little bit. They were about to go out and preach a new gospel to a nation very close to new things. How do I know that Israel was close to new things? Well, they had this really interesting quirk. You see, if you were preaching something they thought was a bit odd, or if they out and out thought you were just preaching heresy, they had this quirk. They stoned you. And now the disciples had only been with Jesus for about a year. Now think about yourself when you had only been a Christian for about a year or even two. I understand, the intense school of Jesus is a little more than we get in a church, but they'd only been with him for a year. And most of them were not educated guys. They were fishermen. They had learned their trade, but they had never finished their formal schooling. I don't have time to go into all of the cultural background of the Jewish culture, but the very fact that Peter and the others that were fishermen were fishing with their dad means that they had not made it through to the highest level of schooling that existed in Israel's culture. And so Jesus says, hey, I've been doing all this great stuff, and now I want you to go out. And don't take anything with you. Now, by all accounts, some pretty amazing stuff happened on that outreach. The word says in verse 9 that Herod, the king himself, heard about all that was going on. And the people were so impressed by everything that they heard, they thought that Elijah or one of the other major prophets had come back to life. It's kind of like a group from West Edmond Christian Assembly going down to Columbia, and some of the things you're going to hear about this morning, and people say, what's the second coming of Benny Hinn? Billy Graham went to Columbia and he just put on makeup so nobody knew who he was. Because nobody could believe that these regular guys could be used by God and do something. See, Jesus didn't send out the disciples just as a bunch of Bible college students or a youth group. He didn't send them out beggars. He sent them out as priests. He knew what was going to happen, and he wanted to send them out in the right way. You see, because when Jesus sent them out, he gave some very specific instructions. He said, don't pack a lunch. Leave your piggy bank at home. And don't even think about begging for coins. Now, you might wonder where I get that. But when Jesus said that they were not to take a beggar's bag, to take a bag, it literally means do not take a beggar's bag. See, in Israel, there was a lot of different things in the culture where you could express a need or an intention without ever saying any words. It's kind of like when the pastor walks around the church with the offering plate underneath his arm. You know what he wants. And in Israel, all they had to do was carry around this particular kind of bag and it would say, I have a need. And Jesus says, no, don't do that. He says, when you go, knock on the door of whoever is worthy and stay there for up to 3 days. And stay there until you go and let them take care of you. Well, in Israel, it was the custom that if a priest was coming through your town, you had the cultural obligation to take him in and provide everything he needed for up to 3 days. Food, lodging, shelter, even people to go with him on his journey to provide for his security until they got to his next stop. So when Jesus sent out the disciples, he said, I'm not sending you out as beggars, I'm sending you out as priests with all the authority to minister in my name. You just need to take advantage of it. And the disciples went out and they saw amazing things happen. But when Jesus sends us out, it's never to send us out. Anytime he gives us a task in ministry, it's never a one-time thing. It's never an event. It's always part of a process. Short-term missions as well is a preparation for future ministry. It's to set you up for a future miracle. When Jesus sent out the disciples, he was sending them out to get them ready for one of history's most well-known miracles. And the disciples almost missed it. For the disciples, they were living on the edge of a miracle, but they were riding on the high of what had happened. They went out, they saw demons cast out, they saw people healed, and they came back to Jesus rejoicing. He says, well, you know what? You shouldn't rejoice so much in what just happens rather than who you are and the kingdom that you have in you. And I think Jesus was saying to the disciples, it's wonderful that you were used by God, but there's something more, there's something bigger that's happening. If we go on to read in verse 9, it says, late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, send the crowd away so we can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we're in a remote place here. And Jesus replies, says, you give them something to eat. They answered, well, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go buy food for all this crowd. Now, what they don't mention here is the 5 loaves and 2 fish that they had is because they had just robbed some kid's lunch. But they also said, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. And they didn't say we don't have the money to go and buy the food. They just say, like, should we really spend everything we have to go and feed these people? It seems from the context of the passage at the moment that they had the money. But Jesus wasn't interested in taking away everything they had. He was interested in what they were willing to offer him. It continues in verse 14. It says, about 5,000 men were there. But he said to the disciples, have them sit down in groups of 50 each. The disciples did so, and everybody sat down. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them, then gave them to the disciples to set before the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now, Jesus had them sit down in groups of 50. And I think that Jesus did that because he knew that although the disciples had just had something miraculous happen in their life, and they could handle feeding and multiplying the food to 50 people, which in itself was a miracle, their faith wasn't big enough to reach 5,000 in one shot. So he broke it down into bite-sized pieces for their faith. Many of you have heard me say this before, but in this world there are 7 billion people. There are 700 million evangelical Christians. If each one of us were to live Jesus to one person per year, in 10 years we would have this world won. Now you could say that that's too simple, but well, it really is simple. But most of us are stuck thinking that God can't use us, and so we don't do anything, and thus the world is going to hell without hope, because we don't realize the miracle that's living inside of us. Now, what the disciples needed to do was not anything big. They just needed to offer what they had to Jesus, stay outside their comfort zone, and be obedient to what God was telling them. And they learned another lesson. When you offer what you have to God, not only will he multiply it, but there will be far more than enough left over. When the disciples were finished, each one had a basket full. I mean, they were eating leftovers for the next 2 weeks. See, when we offer what we have to God, he will always make sure that there's more than enough. The group from Weka, there are a lot of stories from that outreach, but I want to share a little bit about the experience of 2 people in the group. Sandy, a slightly more than middle-aged guy, and Trent, a father who came with his 2 boys, Joshua and Zach. Now, we took them to a little town called Chinquinkira. Chinquinkira is a town of about 60,000 people, very Catholic town. I mean, the Pope's coming to visit next spring. And we've been going there and taking evangelistic teams with the idea of just opening up doors for the local churches, because we've been able to go into the schools in a place that most people said it's impossible. But when we have work teams come in, we do 2 things with them. There's actual physical things that we do, but there's also ministry in the churches that we're doing. Now, we took them to work with a Christian Crusade church, about 170 people, and it's a very dynamic church, and making a huge and really a Herculean effort for them. They were able to renovate their temple, although it's very small for them. The idea is to expand it, taking the back wall, I think it's 60 feet farther back. But even their Sunday school was just in pieces. And in the entire building, they only had 1 working toilet. And that working toilet had a crack down the side of it. I mean, I was really, let's just say I was praying that I never had to do an act of Congress, because I don't think it would have handled me. All right, I managed to embarrass Tom. I have got my goal for this Sunday. That's worth a clap, trust me. Anyway, so we wanted to help them do something different with their Sunday school, to renovate it for them. So we took this group of really serious guys with us. And Sandy, when he was going to come down, he had some issues. He had heard all the stories about Colombia in the past, and he's thinking, man, he was scared. And, you know, anything you've ever heard about Colombia was probably true. It was a much nastier place when I first went down there. But as they say now, the only real danger in going to Colombia is wanting to stay. Because the issues of the guerrilla have mostly been resolved, and now it's just common crime, and as long as you stay in a group, you're fine. But Sandy also had some health issues to think about. A very needy diabetic, and I put it in terms of needy because he's a diabetic and he cannot take any sort of medication for it. He has to manage it entirely through diet, so he's always kind of really living on the edge health-wise. But he came down and he started serving, and I remember him saying that, you know, I was pounding with a hammer and chisel, breaking up concrete and chipping tile for 3 days, and my arm never got tired. I don't understand it. But he was also worried about relationships. He was worried about being able to communicate in a country where he didn't speak the language, of just being shut off, and because he didn't really know the other guys in the group, of not really having any friendships. And yet he became part of this team, and when the team started, I don't think that they would ever expected that a scene like this would turn into something that looked like this. And we were able to install bathrooms, a kitchen. I think now they have 5 working toilets, and none of them are cracked, thank God. And even as he was pounding on the floors, I don't think that he would ever expected that where he started would be where he finished. Now, I don't mean to say that everything they did was work. It certainly wasn't. At least Sandy found different ways to play. This guy's a little squirt bottle there. But, yeah, he got a little tired. We found him like this 2 or 3 different times where his back just started bothering him. He just kind of threw up his legs and laid out on the floor. But they came to do more than work. They had come to minister in the local churches, and I don't think they were ready for that either. Because none of them were preachers, none of them were, aside from the pastor leading the group, and none of them had really, like half of them had never been on international outreach, and half of them had just never really got up on stage. And yet we took them into a local church with their stories, with one of their 3 weapons, the 3 weapons that all Christians have. Because we have the blood of the Lamb, we have the word of our testimony, and we just need to remember that we're not supposed to love our lives so much that we aren't willing to die for our faith. And so we took them into the local church, and the one evening had about 200 guys show up. 200 guys showing up in in a society where fathers are absentee most of the time, or they have this macho idea that, well, I have my wife and I have my harem, because they'll be sleeping around and with 2 or 3 or 4 different women. And where they are becoming, like Canadian society, more and more disconnected from their kids. And we just had the group share their stories, share about their successes and their failures as fathers. And the kids that were in the group would be talking about what they liked and what they disliked about how their father had parented them, and creating a dialogue so that people could see that most of the problems that we face our families are common ones, but yet that Christ can work through all of it. And even Trent and his sons, it was a wonderful dynamic, because they could see that what a loving Christian father was and how the children could turn out. And so the first night we went into the church, we did a dynamic we called conversations, where they would talk back and forth between them. And then the next night we invited asked the fathers to come back, but to bring their families for a family reconciliation night. And the entire congregation was full of scenes like this. Dozens of families being restored, men asking forgiveness for not being part of their kids' lives. Because a group of Canadians came and told their stories. You remember Sandy was worried about not being able to really relate to the locals. Well, he found out that he had a family. And that it's amazing how much you can communicate with gestures and facial expressions and Google Translate. Now for Trent was a different dynamic. Trent was dividing up his family. He was coming down with 2 of his 4 sons, leaving his wife to care for the rest in Edmonton. And he was told he was coming down to help paint a children's home. And actually, if it's possible, guys, can you turn off the front lights for the next few slides? I just want you to be able to see a little better. All right. And so he came with his 2 sons, working with one of our YWAM staff, and he found himself in this state boys' home with 25 boys. And he was new, he was told he was coming down to help paint a children's home. And actually, if it's possible, guys, can you turn off the front lights for the next few slides? I just want you to be able to see a little better. All right. And so he came with his 2 sons, working with one of our YWAM staff, and he found himself in this state boys' home with 25 boys. as soon as he got there, a lot of them wanted to help, and they really had some different skill levels, let me tell you. And sometimes they ended up painting the floor or themselves more than they did the walls. But that room was transformed, as was a lot of the house that they were working in. And more than the painting itself and redoing the song, when we first went in, it was kind of funny. Because I had talked to the director of the home and I said, look, I have this church group coming in. We would like to paint the house for the boys to work as far as we can. He says, please paint the outside of my home. He says, every day I come into work and I'm just ashamed to see what this place looks like. And I said, well, one, I can understand that. I really appreciate it. But we have limited resources to be able to work on your home. And quite frankly, I don't care what the neighbors think. We want to paint the inside of the house. We want to spend time with the boys and leave something behind that will bless them. But I'll make you a deal. I said, we're going to be speaking in local churches, doing some men's ministry, and I'm going to challenge the men in the local churches to come down and see if we can get them to paint the outside of the house. And so we went and we started, having committed to one thing, hoping for another, but no real way to carry that out. And so we got the inside done, and where even the social times became wrapped around just little things, like we stopped to take drink a pop because we were thirsty, and all the kids would gather in around us, and between translator and Google Translate and them coming up with a little bit of broken English, they very soon became where they were forming friendships with Trent and with his boys. And his boys were able to learn the experience firsthand of just how little some kids have around the world. If we accomplished nothing else in this outreach other than changing the worldview of these two boys, we accomplished far more than we could ask or think. Now, Trent himself, I think sometimes he felt a little trapped. Most Colombian homes have bars on the windows because of worrying about thieves coming in. And you could see the outside of the house and what it looked like. Well, over the course of that week, one of the churches that we were working with gave us some of the meals that we thought we were going to have to pay for. And then the one night of men's ministry, we sat down and we talked about the need in that home, and we took up an offering. And so we were able to contract some painters, and this turned into this. Now, did we do more than painting and drinking pop? Yeah, we ate roaster chicken. And we fed them pizza as well and gave them ice cream. We hung out and we spent some deep time with the boys, just being their friends. Even something as simple as soccer. But we came to paint a house. And Juan's kind of like me. He's one of those guys that looks like he's sucking on lemons even when he's in a good mood. And the start of the week, he's just kind of there. By the end of the week, he's smiling from ear to ear. And he's inviting us. He's saying, you know what, my boys really need spiritual influence in their lives. The Catholic Church here hasn't really paid attention to us. The other local churches haven't paid attention to us. But you guys have. Would you come in and do discipleship groups in my home? And that church that we were renovating is now doing discipleship groups with those boys every week. See, a group coming down to serve became part of the miracle of a church that couldn't touch its Sunday school room, so couldn't really have kids in because they only had one working toilet, and even that one was a danger. And the group was able to come down and minister to them. But God, seeing what was coming, he was able to look into the possibilities and speak them to us, and we were able to take them into a church and minister to hundreds of men in the community. And the miracle that was beyond that was what will happen down the road with all of those families that have been touched and influenced, the ripple effects. Another part of the group was able to do what was just painting a home. But then the other church that we were renovating has now been able to follow it up, going in every week, feeding the kids junk food. That's part of children's ministry. Playing soccer, showing the Jesus film, showing other Christian movies, teaching them percussion, just hanging out with them, showing that people love and cared for them. As far as I'm concerned, if there is a Christian church in a town and there's one ministry like a children's home or a single mother's home, those should be the most spoiled people in the entire town, not the most ignored. And we were able to help change the dynamic in Chinquinquirá, so those kids will become some of the most spoiled kids in town. Spoiled for Jesus. That's not a bad thing, is it? Now, I've had people say to me, Darren, why don't we just send the money instead of our teams? And I have to admit, that's a tempting idea for me. It's a tempting idea because as a missionary, I'm always trying to do more things and never having enough funds to do them. And I think every time a team comes down, we have half a dozen teams come down, they're spending $15,000, $20,000. If they just, the 5 or 6 teams that we have every year, if they just sent the money, I can have some missionary fantasies about that. But if I have to choose between the funds and the teams, I will choose the teams every time. Every time. Because not only were we able to do all these things and see God opening up doors that we could never have expected or believed, we were also able to see the change in the people in that team. To see those boys that will be impacted for the rest of their lives. To see Sandy, who was scared to come to Colombia and now just dying to come back. Because it was their going out on outreach experience like Jesus had with the 12. And I want to see that kind of dynamic continue. And that's one of the reasons why we try to get teams launched here, is because we know it will change you. And God will do miracles through you. God wants to do miracles through you. And those miracles have already happened because of people in this church. It was a group from Kingsville Community Church that came down with Chris Martin years ago. And back in those days, we were just doing evangelism in parks, in outside of schools, like just anywhere we could get close to a group of people, in the community centers. And one day a pastor in a town called Subachoque got a bright idea. He said, why don't I go to the local Catholic school and see if they would have this group come in? And we didn't know this was going to happen, but we rolled into the town, and 15 minutes later we found ourselves in front of over 1,000 high school students. And we were all having a bit of a heart attack. Me more than I think than some of them, because I'm thinking, oh man, I got to translate for this, and no, I don't want to mess up. We had no clue, but we presented the gospel to those students. Did so rather spectacularly, I might add. But it wasn't just about that event. It was what God used through a team from this church that showed us that door was open and that we could continue to go into schools and do things that we thought we could never do before. And because of that one team from this church, we have now presented the gospel to tens of thousands of students in schools in and around Colombia. Now, you might think, okay, that's fine for Colombia, but what about here? Well, for the 12, they had their outreach experience. And then they came home, and God wanted to do something with them at home. Jesus had it set up for the feeding of the 5,000. He had it set up for the next miracle. But the disciples, in their excitement about what had happened there, almost missed it here. Now, what God wants to do here in Kingsville is going by nature to look very different than what he wants to do in Columbia. But in a society that is so disconnected from everybody else, a society, or actually even a church that has forgotten that our entire faith is based on sacrifice, one of the greatest needs we have are servant leaders in our local churches. People that will stand alongside the pastor and support his vision. People that will, without thought for their own personal preference, stand behind the vision of the local church. Who will participate in things like Celebrate Canada, that will just do something like actually showing up on the workday at the church, that will come alongside the young mother that doesn't really know how to handle her new child, the person that will come alongside the young man that has no father figure in his lives, to get deeply and utterly involved in the people in and around us, because that is what the church is supposed to be about. And it is through that you will see the biggest miracles. Maybe not in human terms, but in godly terms, the biggest miracles that can happen in this society. People that are willing to love and care and get involved deeply because they desperately want to see God work in and through them. And it's not because he can't do it, it's just because you won't let him. Everything we do in Columbia happens because of you guys. Because of you praying for us, for you supporting us. Hopefully coming down and working with us again, because if we did something so big last time, I'd love to see you down there again and see what God has in store for you the next time. Are you ready to live the miracle that he has waiting for you? And the challenge that we want to leave with you this time. We have our information at the back. If you would like to hear from us on a more regular basis, you can sign up for our mailing list. We also have a little motivational factor for you to visit. We have about 100 packages of chocolate-covered coffee beans back there. And we thank you for helping us do the first 20 years of ministry, and we're looking forward to the next 20. God bless you.
We hope you have enjoyed Jesus and Me, and will listen in again next week. If you would like to know more about Jesus, you can download our free Bible study, Exploring Christ, from our website, kingsvillechurch.com. Just click on the Media tab and scroll down to Resources. If you would like to make a donation, giving to this ministry can be done on our website using PayPal. Scroll down to the bottom of our homepage and click on the PayPal tab. All donations are tax receivable. May God bless you as you follow Jesus.